Good morning. Thanks for joining us. It's my great honor to have this fireside chat, an early fireside chat, maybe coffee side chat, with Mike Casey. So Mike is a renowned author, journalist, most recently head of content at CoinDesk. And after 18 years at the Wall Street Journal, so he's a very accomplished journalist. We're going to talk about a book that he co-authored with Frank McCourt called Our Biggest Fight. And I've listened to the book because, interestingly, and I didn't mention this when we were doing our prep, but I live in the UAE, and this book was not available on the local Amazon, either in physical or digital form.
We'll fix that.
Yeah. And I thought that was very interesting because the book itself is about having a freer internet and a vision of that. And so maybe you want to say a few words about the book, and then I'll ask a few questions.
Sure. Yeah, that's actually a good, pertinent way to think about it, because Amazon is one of the big platforms that we highlight in the book, right? Essentially, the book is about the idea that this vision for a decentralized open access internet, a sort of free and widely available information system, has essentially been hijacked by some very, very large, powerful entities. And we go so far to describe them as sort of digital feudal systems, and that we're actually essentially creating an entirely new political economy in which we are beholden to the systems, the algorithms, and these really quite invasive surveillance systems that these platforms have built. And so Amazon is a particular breed of that because it uses its algorithm more in the e-commerce world than the social media world, but it still is, engaged in massive data aggregation, essentially, using our data. Our point in the book is that, you need to think about your data really as your personhood, because in the digital age, the footprints we leave over the internet are really who we are, right? We are constantly engaging with each other and building friendships and relationships, and all of it is happening online. And so the distinction between our physical selves and our digital lives is essentially gone away. So if you think of it in those terms, the idea that somebody could own all of that data, it's essentially owning you. So we make the point in the book that this is a human right that we need to fight for. The right to control your data is as important as any human right that we've had.
Right. And in the book, it's divided into like the 4 R's: the rights, the responsibilities, the rewards, and the rules. Would you say a little bit about each one?
Yeah, and the thinking behind that construct was that we are trying to imagine what a sort of a more appropriate digital society would look like. In the digital age, how might we replicate the elements of what a good functioning democracy is as we understand it in the analog world? And so those terms relate to what we see as the fundamental pieces. So the rights, of course, is the rights of the individual. And these are, we use the American project as a way. So the American Revolution and the history of the construct of America as a framework. But of course, you could apply this to any good functioning Western democracy, such as, Switzerland or Italy. And, basically we start with this idea that we need to respect firstly the rights of the individual. So what does that mean? That means that you have control of your data. That data control is the sort of the fundamental piece of that, and we talk through all of the ramifications of that. The responsibilities is this inherent social contract that exists in any functioning, good, decent civil society, where people have these norms of behavior and functioning ways of dealing with each other that help to underpin society as a whole. We all have rights, but we also have responsibilities to each other. And so how might we construct a system in which we are not algorithmically driven to be divisive? One of the key points of the book is that we've built a system that is in the interest, the incentives are misaligned, right? The platforms have an interest in keeping us fighting with each other because that keeps us engaged in the platform. So that's not very constructive from a social perspective, but it might be useful for a platform or a company to make a lot of money out of it. So how do we build a system that actually enables a much more constructive social relationship with each other? The third piece is rewards, and that takes from the idea of incentives, which is the functioning of the foundations of a good market economy. So, how might a new economy emerge in a world in which everybody controls their data? What business models would start to emerge when it's not built around this massive aggregation anymore, but human beings have control of that? That's a new way of thinking about the marketplace. And in fact, I would argue it's a much more fundamentally market-driven one because it's about digital property rights that belong to the individual in the same way that all the great market and economic launches of capitalism were built upon the idea of the extension of property rights to individuals and to companies. And then the fourth is rules, because whether we like it or not, we still need to have some system of governance, right? Some sort of governance. And so you sort of imagine, what does a decentralized governance system look like? And I'm actually lucky enough to be back on stage here in the afternoon with my good friend Ed Hesse to talk a little bit about what, Web3 government would look like. So there you go.
So we can spend the whole panel on any one of those R's. I think the first two are probably more self-evident, and the question is how to enforce. But I think the third one, the reward part, is the most interesting and also maybe the most difficult to create a functional marketplace. Any ideas on how that's actually going to be able to spring up? I know we have Trent McConaughey, the founder of Ocean Protocol. I don't know if he's in the room right now. There he is. And so, Ocean Protocol is addressing data and unlocking siloed data for independent AI to train on, which is very much in line. And Ocean was founded when? 2016? 17? 2017.
Ahead of its time.
And there have been quite some challenges, putting the building blocks together and having the agents on both sides, the data side, the havers of the data and the consumers of the data. How do you envision a marketplace can really start for like discrete personal data?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of pieces that need to fall into place, right? So we're not shying away from the idea that there are fundamental changes to the structure of the online economy that need to take place before we can start to build this, more effective economy around it. And part of it is, the fact that a significantly large enough group of people or individuals or businesses, right, any of these nodes will actually migrate away from a dependence upon these centralized platforms to something that is under their control. So, Frank McCourt, my co-author, of course, is the founder of Project Liberty. Project Liberty, some of you might, there's some news out yesterday.
Yeah. And interestingly, I think probably Mike can't talk about it, but it was announced yesterday that Frank McCourt, I don't know, it wasn't Project Liberty. I think it was Frank McCourt is leading a consortium to purchase TikTok USA, which is massive.
It's a big deal. And I really can't talk much about it because I'm not really involved in that. But it is an interesting way to frame this conversation. Because if you think about TikTok, right, the fundamental challenge is is that it has a massive network effect, right? I don't know how many users TikTok, 170 million users worldwide. Thank you very much, Ursula. And so how do you replicate that? And so acquiring the US version of that is one way to do it, but you still have to maintain them. And these algorithms are built around engagement. That's the whole point. So, we need kind of an awareness and a willingness to emerge from people. But I do think that there's a lot that the business community can do to think creatively. And I'd love to have a chat to Trent about what his views on this are, to start building new business models around this principle. Because, there's just step back a little bit. Like one of the things that would often come back as an argument against what we were proposing in the book was that, look, owning your own data has very little economic value. That it's too small. It's only valuable in the aggregate. It needs to be aggregated to be valuable. That is the line that sometimes gets thrown back at us. To which I always say, well, yes, under the existing paradigm of aggregated centralized systems. We don't really, it's a completely different paradigm if the economy itself is built around, individual or business ownership of that data. So now, like, what are the business models that emerge out of this? And I would just say that I don't know, because this is the beauty of a market system, right? Like, let's get creative, let's get inventive as to what we could build on a model like that. But in the book, we do explore some examples, right? So I'm a media guy. I come from the journalism world. I started thinking, well, like, what if instead of having to, as a publisher, a newspaper or a magazine, had to defer its sort of audience engagement strategy to some third party, i.e. Facebook or Google, and instead acted themselves as the intermediaries, as they should be, and this is in the good meaning of the word intermediary, I would argue, between their advertisers and their audience. So they regain the control of the audience. And that if you've got consenting users who are saying, hey, here's my data, and I'm going to use a zero knowledge proof or some other system to anonymize myself, so I'm not exposing my information about myself, but I do want to signal to the marketplace that I'm interested in buying a car, then as the media company, I'm now a matchmaker, and there's now a string of dealers or automakers who have the knowledge that it's not just somebody who's being tracked and surveilled out there when we think they want to buy a car. They are literally telling us with consent that they do. And that creates a new form of marketplace. So there's just different ways we can start thinking about this. And I'll just say one more piece about this. I'm a huge fan of a gentleman that I was the pleasure of getting to know when I was at the Wall Street Journal, called Hernando de Soto. Anyone you know who Hernando is? Okay, there's a hand. Trent's got his hand up. Very good. So I would argue, very important economist from Peru who wrote a book called The Mystery of Capital. And his thesis is that property rights are the core of a functioning capitalist system, and that the legal structures that we've placed around that enable people to extract the things that they own and convert them into value, like a mortgage on a house, right? And the idea of extending to an individual or a company, an entity that says, you have that right and we will respect that right, it has always created value. When Deng Xiaoping finally took control of the Chinese Communist Party, and one of the most important things he did was to extend the right to own your home to Chinese households. I would argue that that's one of the most important explosive elements of China's growth story that happened after that. So, digital property rights. If we transfer this concept to everybody, just start imagining what sort of economic explosion we could unleash in that world, right? So I don't know what the answers are as to how we get there, but I do think that is the right framework to imagine a vibrant, engaging, and more effective online economy.
Great. So there's going to be some necessary components, some building blocks. One of them is DIDs, which we'll talk about in detail on the next panel. And I know that's mentioned extensively as one of the first parts of the solution in the book. Would you elaborate a little bit about the book's idea of?
Yeah, sure. So one person who really would help this is Braxton in the room. Braxton Woodham. That's Braxton. There he is, hand up over there. So Braxton is one of the two co-founders and architects of DSNP, the Decentralized Social Networking Protocol, which is the sort of tech solution, the base layer protocol solution that Project Liberty is supporting to try to create a much more empowering and self-ownership data model for the internet. And Braxton, if I say anything incorrect, just stand up and wag your finger at me and I'll get it right. But But yes, I mean, the building block has to be some idea of self-sovereign identity, right? A DID is a standard that recognizes the owner of that data as being the entity in charge of that, and there's a whole sort of structure around it in terms of the signaling power and the consenting and permissioning capacity that the owner of that DID has over their data. So it's the building block, and I think it comes from out of this tradition of that's really emerged, I think, in parallel really to blockchains. I don't know. I think they're somewhat inseparable, but in some respects a separate concept, self-sovereign identity. And it's a fundamentally important notion that rather than having to sort of be beholden to some external entity that essentially decides who you are, right? Like, I think a great analogy for me is a refugee. And I remember when I was thinking about this a lot and writing about it, it was the time of the Syrian war. And there were a lot of Syrian refugees, as people would remember, in Europe, making their way here out of desperation. And to sort of assert their identity and gain access to, services and everything that they needed to rely on a passport that was issued by the very regime that they were escaping, right? So a dependence, they needed Assad essentially to assert and confirm that they are a legitimate person. Right? That is a completely destructive and toxic sort of dependency. So how do we build a model in which, yes, you still need the certification and say so, if you like, of an entity that says, yes, Mark, you do have a degree from this university, but it's you that is essentially giving the right for somebody else to access that information, right? That you're in charge of who gets to see what about you matters, right? This is the core building block of everything. And then DSNP, that, as I said, Braxton would be able to give you a much better explanation of, is a system that's built on top of all of that.
And so now maybe back to rights a little bit, which feeds into that. So if you have a right to an identity, which I think can be self-evident, or maybe a right to a digital identity, which maybe is less self-evident. So we spoke a lot about the Bill of Rights, the U.S. Bill of Rights, and then the UN Charter of Human Rights. Am I saying it?
The Declaration of Human Rights.
Declaration of Human Rights. What about a Declaration of Digital Rights? Where is that?
So I didn't know that you were going to give me a chance to shill consensus. Consensus, as some of you hopefully would know, whoever's been there, who's been to consensus? And it's a decent event. Okay, it's CoinDesk's annual event, and I'm privileged enough to be the chairman of it. And one of the things that we founded there is a thing called Consensus at Consensus, which is a project that brings together people, stakeholders from various interests to get their heads around knotty, difficult issues. And we have a Chatham House rules kind of meeting, and then we bring that conversation out into the public. And the idea is to try to solve a problem. One of the four topics that we're doing this year is like, what would a digital rights Bill of Digital Rights look like? And it's built around some of the ideas in the book that what does digital citizenship actually mean? So again, citizenship, I would say, is something that is both rights and responsibilities. That the role of a citizen is this, but citizenship is a sort of a foundational piece of this, because we need to think about what it means to be a sovereign individual in a world in which our relationships in the digital sphere are almost separated from the geographical world we're in. So it is a very different, I think the foundational aspects of the existing Bill of Rights, both the US and the Declaration and various other constitutions around the world, are the things that we need to always come back to, right? The sanctity of the human being, the right to free speech. These things have to be fundamental. But the expression of that, it needs this sort of upgrade for the digital world. The recognition, as I said, that what it means to be a person in the digital age is integrally connected to the data that we create. So it's interesting. Like Frank, my co-author, will often say, we don't need a new Bill of Rights. We need to apply the existing one to this digital realm. And I think that's a perfectly reasonable answer, by the way. But I do think there needs to be some form of translation of those concepts into the digital age, because we don't think of the digital sphere in the same way. We've still got this IRL concept, right? That the analog world is IRL, and this other thing's somehow fake. We've got to stop thinking like that. We are digital human beings now. It's just whether we like it or not, and it's just going to obviously get all the more intense as we barrel our way into the AI age. So we need to at least translate and conceive of the Bill of Rights in a digital context.
Yeah, and so I wanted to speak a little bit about some of the anecdotal stories you had in the book, because I have a similar story. That I'm born in the U.S. I spent 30 years there, moved to Austria for 18 years, and then spent the last 3 years in the United Arab Emirates in Dubai. And each place, the society is organized differently. And the way people behave with each other and the way people behave socially is differently. And you had a very interesting story about Argentina, how people are absolutely in person lovely, and you would give your children to a stranger because it's a family-oriented place that people take care of each other's children. But then somebody will, in a very wealthy neighborhood, will just throw a coffee off the balcony and leave the cup like that, which is actually not very socially oriented. And it's different in each place, but each place has its own flavor, and some are constructive and some not so constructive. And how do you fit that into the digital world where everybody has a different moray of social interaction?
Yeah, I'm so glad you picked up on it, because it's those of you who know me know that Argentina, it means a lot to me, right? I had this, and I think I lived there for 6 years. I was the Wall Street Journal's bureau chief there, and it was a love-hate relationship. I absolutely loved my time there. I thought it was going to be a 2-year assignment, and it ended up being 6 years. My youngest daughter was born there. My eldest was only 1.5 when they got there. So their formative childhood years occurred there. But once my eldest got to the age of 9, I decided I don't think that this is where I want her to grow up, because I didn't want her to be sort of affected by what really is a dysfunctional civil society. Like one of the, and I don't know if there are any Argentines in the room, but I love you, but my God, how did you screw that up, right? I mean, what a blessing that country has in terms of natural resources, in terms of both educational and people. I mean, very, very smart, creative people. But as many of you would know, it is a disaster economically. There is probably the poster child for screwing up the blessings of the resources that you have. And I've thought long and hard about it, because I spent 6 years writing about its financial crises over and over again and trying to get to the bottom of it. And it really, and I've got big theories about colonial history and such. But at the end of the day, it all comes down to how the social covenant is broken, that people haven't constructed trust in each other, or at least in the institutions that ride above the broader society, which we think of as government, obviously. And so instead you default to close familial ties. People describe Italy in the same way, of course, right? That Italy has these strong family bonds that emerge. Almost by default, family and friends become your trust circle, because the higher level is a bit dysfunctional, right? And so this story is really trying to think about the lessons from that, and think about how do we apply it to the digital world. And yes, it gets complicated, because there is these distinct cultures, these distinct norms. And as I said, I would, in many respects, much rather hand my child over to an Argentine stranger to entertain and to be part of than in the United States, where you think this was like some threat of some sort, or this person, there's fear of people at that level, whereas this friendship, this strength bonds exists there. So I wouldn't want to destroy that, right? And you don't really want to homogenize either. So one of the things that I thought was really interesting as we tried to explore through the book what DSNP could be as a building block for new forms of community arrangement and governance, was to think about some of the principles that actually the United States was built on, this principle of self-governance. And self-governance starts with the individual, but it's also community-based, right? So you don't want to have consistent, this starts to look like the Soviet Union, right? If there's only one cultural norm that is applied across the entire system. But what you do want is for people who have shared interests and values and connections to be able to formulate their own structures in a digital environment, their own rules, their own engagement. It's not, we necessarily need some structure to do so. And I think what's interesting, some people as we're moving into the AI age are trying to think about how do we train AI systems to flexibly deal with the needs of a kind of a cross-cultural digital world that we live in, but somehow bring into these different regions and spaces some of those cultural norms that are unique to each place. So I think this is one of these things we can't necessarily say what it looks like, but I think the smart people who come to conferences like this should be thinking hard about how would I start to apply some of the best parts about a culture in a digital environment and lose the worst parts, right? I don't know if that answers the question, but it's a complicated one.
Absolutely. So we're running almost out of time, but before we do, and before we open for questions, what are you working on now?
Oh, okay. So I was sort of, I wasn't exactly showing the door at CoinDesk because they also kept me on as an advisor, as a chairman of Consensus, but it's a different relationship than the one I had before. And the beauty of that is that I was able to then spend a lot of my time focusing on a startup that I was exploring even before I left CoinDesk. And what we're doing is we're trying to fix the problem of film financing and film development, specifically for documentaries, because if any of you in the documentary business would know, the expansion of Netflix, Hulu, and so forth was briefly a great moment where there was oodles of indie content being purchased, but right now the window has become very, very narrow. It's only a Taylor Swift blockbuster or nothing. So all of these stories that should be told are not being told. And we are essentially bringing in the power of DeFi and liquidity that comes into the sort of the yield earning capacity of that to de-risk the funding piece of it, and then integrating underneath that Web3 solutions that really build engagement and audience and allow for the sort of fans and supporters of a particular topic or film to be more directly engaged and therefore bring in the economic value into the film project. And through that, hopefully find a way through to unlocking film. So anybody wants to talk about it, please come and hit me up, and I'll happily opine on what we're doing. But thank you.
Thank you. So we don't have time for questions, but we'll take one or two if anybody has a pressing question.
Can you give us a conclusion on the findings in the book and if there are... Okay, thank you. Could you give us a conclusion of your findings in the book and in which regions in the world the most promising developments in digital development identity are happening? I mean, Mark mentioned Dubai, and I think this is really a hot spot. So how do you see that geography?
What we didn't, the book did not go through an exercise of trying to identify places. So I'll just spin from the top of my head, I suppose. I think that, yes, Dubai, anywhere that's exploring some sort of regulatory framework, because let's face reality, we can't avoid the existence of these old analog systems of government. So we do need to recognize the importance of that. But before I say that, I would also add that, like, we can't wait for government to do things. We need to migrate ourselves, because the reality is that our political systems, our democracies, are themselves undermined and beholden to these systems. Having said that, yes, we are going to need a political solution as well. And so I think that, yes, governments that are seeing that there are these citizens that they need to recognize and give them the power to, so that their actual status, if you like, is defined by this self-sovereign concept, and that all of their services of government are now built around a model in which people control their data. And so whether it's your driver's license or that they're shifting to a model in which people have control. I think that those are the most constructive ones to build upon at this stage. I think actually one of the topics that I think is going to be very interesting, I'm excited to work with some folks in Bermuda who are exploring DNA, and the idea that we actually, we're moving to this world, of course, where genetics is so powerful. It's a valuable resource, but it is all entirely digital as well. The distinction between your DNA and your digital world, again, completely blurred. So the idea of giving people the right to, as sovereign identities, sovereign individuals, to control their digital DNA as an asset, these sorts of concepts are the ones that I think are really just important. Yeah.